Welcome to the Sports Spectrum Podcast, where faith and sports collide. Here's your host, Jason Romano.
This is episode number 50 of the Sports Spectrum Podcast. Hi, everyone. My name is Jason Romano, and first off, thank you. Thank you for all the support. Thank you for the kind words. Thank you for tuning in, and thank you for subscribing and listening to the Sports Spectrum Podcast. We've made it to 50 episodes, and we're very proud and grateful to God for all that He has done through this ministry, through this podcast, and we're thankful for you to be listening, and we're excited to see what the next 50 holds. Lots of exciting plans in the works, and just so grateful for this podcast to even be a thing, and grateful for all the guests that have joined us and shared their very personal and poignant stories here on the Sports Spectrum Podcast. Today's guest on episode number 50 is WWE Hall of Famer Ted DiBiase, the $1 Million Man himself. Now, if you're like me, in your late 30s, early 40s, and you grew up in the late 1980s watching WWF wrestling, the $1 Million Man was the most notorious bad guy there was in wrestling. You had Hulk Hogan and Randy Macho Man Savage and guys like that, Jimmy Superfly Snuka, like those were the good guys, and then you had the bad guys like Ted DiBiase, the $1 Million Man. And so growing up watching him, I was always intrigued by his story. And recently, over the past couple years, I started being even more intrigued. And the reason was that I found out that he is now a traveling evangelist. And he goes around the country sharing and speaking about his story, about his walk of faith in Christ, and how God has really changed his life and turned his life around. And so we were thinking, all right, this would be a pretty good guy to share his story on the podcast. And here he is. So we were putting together the ideas for this podcast over the last 4 or 5 months, and his name came about, and he's got a new documentary coming out on November 7th. It's a one-night only sort of thing called The Price of Fame. And when I saw that, I was like, man, how cool would it be to get Ted DiBiase on this podcast and hear his story? And so we've done that, and his story is incredible. It's really powerful. A lot of brokenness, a lot of mess-ups, and a lot of healing that took place in his life. And God has really restored him and redeemed him and taken him to a place now where he can make Jesus' name known through the brokenness that was his story in the professional wrestling realm. And not just what happened sort of in the ring, but it's really what's happened in his life outside of the ring. His family, his kids, reconciling and repairing these relationships that were broken for so many years. So without further ado, here he is, the $1 Million Man himself. He is WWE Hall of Famer on episode number 50 of the Sports Spectrum Podcast, Ted DiBiase. Ted, welcome to the program.
It's great to be with you, my friend.
It is awesome to talk with you, and we're going to talk a lot about your career and sort of everything that you've been known for as far as wrestling in the world. But I want to talk and start with your new documentary. This movie, The Price of Fame, is out one time only in theaters November 7th, and then we'll talk about how else people can get a hold of it after that. But let's start there. The movie, The Price of Fame, the documentary, I was fortunate enough to see a preview of it. Fantastic, really well done, very powerful story there. What made you decide to put this together and share your story?
Well, people of faith will understand as soon as I say this, but it's a God thing. Several years ago, I was approached by Peter Fierro. Peter is one of the producers. He's actually the guy who initially approached me about doing this. But the way we met, Pete was asked by someone to film a shoot interview with me. And of course, for wrestling fans, a shoot interview it's not wrestling storylines, it's talking about your real life. And so when you start talking to me about my real life, you're going to start hearing about Jesus and what he's done in it. Yeah. And so in Pete's own words, he said at the time of this interview, he's shooting this interview and asking me these questions, and so my story resonates with him because he says at the time, he says, I'm the son of a minister, and at the time was somewhat backslidden. And he said, that my story had resonated with him and made him realize, his need to get right with God. And So Pete and I developed a friendship and a relationship. And then he came to me one day and he said, Ted, I would like to do a documentary. I'd like to tell your story on film. Now, Pete's normal everyday job is he does uh, wedding photography and video. So he basically documents weddings. It's like, you're telling the story. So but as far as, shooting film and all that stuff. So he had a lot of experience doing that, but he'd never really, tested the waters and like he has on this. And I was just, personally, I was blown away by it myself. I mean, when I sat down and watched my own story that I've told 1,000 times on film, it made me weep. And again, before you even ask, what I want people to walk away from this film with, even if you're not a believer or a person of faith at all, I want people to understand that real happiness in life doesn't come from money and power and prestige and fame and big houses and fancy cars. The real happiness in life comes from family, relationships. And I have found, and again, it took God allowing me to go get more of that than I ever thought I'd have.
This documentary, Ted, is so real and powerful for me personally. Growing up, one of three boys, broken relationship with our father, a lot of forgiveness, a lot of stuff going on, a lot of abuse, that type of thing. So it really hit home for me personally. And watching it, I could sense that, because when you have a camera on you, you've had a camera on you for how many years now, 30 years or whatever, wrestling, and then this, it's easy to kind of play it up to the camera. But this documentary, I saw some real powerful, poignant moments. And you talked about weeping watching it, but you wept at the end of this too. And there was some stuff that I could tell that God was working through you, even in just the recording of this, the sin, the past, the infidelity, the relationship with your kids, as you mentioned. Why be so open about all your struggles in a documentary like this? Why be so open?
Well, that's just it. I want, I speak all over the country, and I find myself more and more speaking to large bodies of men, and because men really need to hear it. If you put a bunch of women in a room, you give them 20 minutes, and they're pouring their life out to each other.
Yeah,
they have no problem being transparent. But you put a bunch of guys in a room, and you ask a guy, how you doing, man? He's going to tell you he's doing great, especially if he's just met you, because his pride is not going to let him tell you otherwise. And that's what I want men to start to understand. It's okay to be transparent. It's okay to show vulnerability. And that's the one thing that I try to do everywhere I go, is be as open and transparent about this as I possibly can. Because the bottom line is, the problem in my life for 20 years was pride. The opposite of that. It was, boy, look at me, the whole ego thing. Mm-hmm. And God broke me. And I said, when he broke me, he broke me. And so I have no problem. And it's like, my life is an open book. And if somebody can learn from that and it can help them overcome an issue in their life, then more power to them.
We're talking to Ted DiBiase here on the Sports Spectrum podcast, and we're going to dive deeper into that moment when you made Christ the Lord of your life and how God really broke you and turned you around into the person that you are now. But I want to go back a little bit. I was a child of the 1980s. I'm in my early 40s now, and the WWF, now WWE, gigantic part of my adolescent years, as it was for many kids. And in 1987, you come along and you join the WWF, the World Wrestling Federation, and become the $1 Million Man. This was a time before your faith in Christ became central to who you were. And so I'm really just interested in knowing, looking back on those early days of being one of the most hated villains in pro wrestling history, how do you view those times? How do you when you look back at those, what kind of memories and thoughts come to your mind?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of emotion there and a lot of mixed feelings. Number one, it was um, incredible to go from regional wrestling and wrestling as I had known it all my life. I mean, territorial going to this territory, the next territory, and then all of a sudden Vince McMahon comes along and goes nationwide with WrestleMania, and now, instead of seeing your wrestling show from and your audience being like two sets of bleachers in a local regional television station,
Right.
every show you see is from a coliseum, and it's become bigger than life. So it was a little bit surreal because now I'm going from this to literally, and especially with the gimmick that Vince gave me, going from driving everywhere to not only flying everywhere, but flying first class with limousine service and staying at first class hotels and the whole deal. And that's part of that story. It's getting caught up in that uh, uh, and um, letting it consume you. Um, and that's pretty much what happened to me is I got caught up in that. There was never a question of the love I had for my wife or my children. I mean, I would die for all of them. Uh, the issue was ego. The issue was filling a void created by being gone so much. And of course, here's the thing: I also want people to understand: you can't put the blame on the WWE or the NFL or the NBA or Major League Baseball. Or I said, you know what? When you get in the game, you know what the rules are. You know what the conditions are, and we are all the sum total of the choices we make. And it's what you do with that situation. And in talking to young guys getting into the business today, one of the things that I tell them is I said, if you want to stay straight, I said, then you build accountability into your life. Uh, you need to have two or three uh, guys, that you trust, that know you, and they know you intimately. They know all the good about you, and they know the bad about you, and they love you anyway. And your willingness and openness to go to them in times of struggle, and to be open and honest with them when they confront you. And if you do that, then that's building safeguards into your life that are necessary. When I talk about fame, I mean, people look at that and they go, "Oh man," it's like, gosh, like I tell everybody, the largest crowd I ever wrestled in front of was 80,000 people at Wembley Stadium, and I said to walk into a stadium that's packed,
Mm-hmm.
80,000 people, and they are screaming, and everybody knows who you are. That's a pretty big thrill.
Yeah.
But when that match is over and I've taken a shower and I leave that building and I go back to the hotel and I go, and and again that particular show, I'm in London, England, a city I don't know,
Yep.
and I'm staring at four walls and a television, and my wife's not there, my kids aren't there, and then I do that day after day after day after day. I said it can be a very lonely place. And a lot of times it's filling that void that causes all these other things in your life. But I mean, they don't cause them. You have to, again, build the safeguards into your life so those things don't happen.
You kind of touched on it a little bit, but give us a snapshot of the rigors of the type of travel you were involved in, being a WWE wrestler and obviously a manager, and just being involved in the business. The rigors of travel that I think a lot of people don't realize. There's a lot of traveling, obviously, in baseball and football and basketball, but I don't know if there's anything like it is to be a pro wrestler, especially back then. Give us a snapshot of what that was like.
Well, I mean, if you go all the way back to the regional days of wrestling, we didn't have days off.
Hmm.
If you wanted a day off, you had to ask for a day off, and you better have a pretty good reason for wanting it. I mean, we wrestled every day of the week. Now, your day off might be considered the day when you wrestle in the town that's like the base of that territory, wherever you have an apartment,
Hmm.
and and so for the first 12 years of my career, unless I got like, and I take a Christmas break and I have a vacation there or something like that, there weren't days off. And um, then I go to the WWE, and now initially when I first went there, they were doing it this way. We would be on the road 3 straight weeks, 21 days, 21 cities, and then we would go home for a week, and then we'd go do it again. So you were off a week a month, and in reality, you're really off 5 days because one on your first day off, you're traveling home. So half that day's shot because you're traveling home. And then your last day off, you're actually leaving again to be where you need to be for the first day of the next tour. And but since then, again, everything evolves. Then they decided that's still too long to be away for guys with families. So they started doing it 10 days on with 3 days off, and then you'd go back on a short 4-day run and then have 3 days off again. So they split it up to where you weren't gone for, 3 full weeks at a time. But any way you look at it, you're still only home. Really, realistically, you're only home 6 days a month. And that's hard when you have a wife and you have children. And but it's the nature of the beast as well. And when we were traveling like rock stars, it was, there were days I would wake up in a hotel and I'd lay there and I'd laugh. And I'd just think, where am I? And I'd either have to look out the window or look at the nameplate on the phone and go, oh yeah, I'm in Milwaukee or wherever it was. And I thought that was kind of funny, but again, it's not as glamorous as everybody thinks it is. And you know what? I'm not taking anything from any other job. Every vocation in life has its good and its bad, but I just want people to know that being famous is not as glamorous as it seems to a lot of people.
For you, Ted DiBiase, traveling and the rigors of that, you kind of touched on it a little bit, but how did that affect you as a family man? You were married young and then, had children. You have 3 boys. How is that? And you kind of grew up in that world with your dad being a wrestler as well. So how did that affect the family dynamic for you when you were younger?
Well, again, I was married and divorced. I got married the first time when I was 20.
Mm.
I really don't know any 20-year-old men. And I only, at the age of 63, I say, okay, you're a young man, but you're not a full grown man yet, even at 20. But very immature. Anyway, that marriage lasted 6 years, and out of that marriage came a son. I had a son, my firstborn son, Michael, and I eventually got Michael back when Melanie and I married. Michael we were allowed to get him when he was 11. And by that time we had our boys. Well, I think it was, I can't remember the year now, but by the time I went to the WWF in '87, Michael was with us. So I had 3 boys. And actually my youngest son, Brett was born, on, March the 16th, 1981. Well, he was born, and then once he was born, I kissed my wife, and I knew she was okay, and I got on a plane, and I flew to New York, and I went to Atlantic City for WrestleMania 4. My first WrestleMania was just after the birth of my last son. But
Wow.
again, I love my wife. She's my soulmate. I loved her then. I loved her now. I love my children. And in reality, I would never do anything to hurt them. But you deceive yourself, and you take that attitude. Well, there was never a question of my love. all, and so what I obviously was caught in was ultimately was adultery. But it was not, and it was never, it was not like another relationship that I'm falling for somebody else. It was all for the moment. It was all, here today and gone tomorrow. And it's ugly, because it's all feeding an ego trip. And, and I look back at that from where I am now, and I say that I said, what was I thinking? How can, now I look at that and I think, how stupid could you be? And, but I was, and for a time, but when it all came crashing in, I realized in an instant, when I knew the cat was out of the bag and that I had hurt the person I love the most more deeply than anybody could ever hurt her. That crushed me, and to realize that I was the cause of that pain, it really seared me. But the other thing it made me realize in an instant, it's as if God said, okay, Ted, you got everything you thought you ever wanted. You're a bigger star than you ever dreamed you're going to be. You're traveling in first class, and you have all this stuff. And right now, what does that mean to you? And brother, in that moment, it didn't mean squat.
Right.
Because what I didn't have was any integrity. What I didn't have was strong character. And what I had been was as selfish as anybody could be. And the reality of that hit me really hard. And I really believed that, I really did believe that it was going to cost me everything. And by the grace of God, it didn't. The grace of God and a strong wife with a very strong faith. I tell people all the time, if Melanie had not been as grounded as she was in her faith, I don't think I'd be sharing with you. Well, I might be sharing the story with you, but I might be sharing with you the regret of losing her. But another thing that I can say that brings me great joy, I can tell you with all assurance that today my wife and I are closer than we've ever been. She's absolutely unconditionally my very best friend. And our joy as a married couple is greater than it's ever been, and only God can do that. And so that's, and I share that with everybody. I was the recipient of a lot of grace and forgiveness, not only from my God but from my wife.
Ted, what was the sort of, you talked about the low point of infidelity and your wife kind of, you crushing your wife, if you will, or disappointing her. But then what was the moment when you made Christ the Lord of your life? Was that it? Was there somebody else besides the seeds that had been planted from your wife and her being grounded in her faith for you to finally say yes to the Lord? What was that moment for you when that occurred?
A man who's my best friend today is Hal Santos. He's a pastor. He was a youth minister when I met him. And we sat down and had a conversation one day in a gym in Baton Rouge, and that started a relationship. And Hal just stayed in touch with me all the time for 10 years. And in my darkest hour, I called Hal, and he arranged for us to fly to St. Louis. My wife and I, that's where his church is, in that St. Louis area. Mm-hmm. And, on the way to face my wife, Hal said, Ted, he said, Jesus said the truth would set you free. He never said it'd be easy. He never said it would be without cost. But he did say it would set you free. He said, if you'll trust Jesus today, trust him like you did when you were a young man after your father's death and your mother's sinking into alcoholism. Put that faith in him today, and he'll forgive you and he'll restore you. And he said, but remember that the Bible also says you will reap what you sow. there are always consequences to our choices. And in your case, the consequence could be that you lose everything. And he said, but even if that happens, even if the worst happens, he said, if you'll trust Christ through this storm, you're going to come out of the storm on the other side with a peace in your life that you've never had, a peace that the Bible describes as surpassing all understanding. And I knew that was true. And um, again, that was that moment in time when God allowed me to see me as I really was, where He's saying, all the worldly success that you could ever dream of, but you're empty. And that was in my life where I gave up the helm of the ship, so to speak. And I tell people this all the time. We speak about committing our life to Christ, but before you can commit your life to Christ, you have to surrender it first.
Yep.
And you're either all in or you're not in. And up until that point in my life, I had been trying, and not even in a very real way, to have a relationship with God based on what my terms were and not His. And God's got a plan for your life. So are you walking in God's plan for your life, or are you to shove your plan down God's throat? Um, and that's when I gave up the ghost. That's when I said, you know what, God, I don't even know what this means yet, but here I am. You take the helm of the ship. You know, take my life wherever you want it to go. And I was at the time that I prayed this prayer, I really believed and deserved to lose my wife and my family.
Yeah.
But God not only restored me, but He restored it all.
That's
And
awesome. I love that
yeah,
story. Now, Ted, how are you in the world of pro wrestling now? Maybe not now even, but right after you became a Christian and what that's doing to your life, and you're starting to see this new nature, being renewed, as the Bible says in Romans, they're transforming and renewing of our minds. For
right.
you, how are then you received in the pro wrestling world as you become this evangelist, so to speak? You become this believer. Was it one of those, man, I got to tell everybody about it? Or was it one of those sort of gradual things that then suddenly the wrestling world's around like, well, this guy's a different guy than he was before? How were you received in the wrestling world?
Well, I mean, initially a lot of skepticism, and rightfully so.
Right.
A lot of guys, even like Lex is. I mean, one of the things Lex said. Lex just he said, Ted almost got a divorce. He's just trying to save his marriage. He'll be back. They all just thought that it was, in wrestling terminology, a work. But as time went on, and people obviously kept watching, and they realized that it wasn't a work, that I was sincerely a changed person. And as a result, God even used that, because there are several guys whose lives were impacted in some way by my story.
Well, that's what I wanted to ask you. Can you, in the documentary, which I was able to see, it's called The Price of Fame. There are people, very familiar WWE superstars in this documentary, that talk about how, the impact you've had and the impact your story has had on them. Can you share a little bit about, you mentioned Lex, I assume you mean Lex Luger, and a few of the other
Correct.
guys from wrestling and
Yeah.
seeing their lives transformed?
Yeah. Well, Lex was later. Lex, came to an athletes conference out in Phoenix. But I mean, his transformation started when, he woke up that morning in a hotel in San Francisco and couldn't move.
Hmm.
It's like, and you ought to have, you hear Lex tell his story about, you talk about God getting your attention. And George Animal Steele, God bless him, he's gone on to be with the Lord. And George, he was one of the agents in Europe. When I got that phone call, because I had confessed to Hal, and then I had to get on a plane and fly to Europe. And then I got a phone call and said, you better get home. And so I went to George and I said, I've got to go home. I said, I'm probably going to lose my family. And I said, and I said, at this point, I don't care if I get fired. This is something I have to do. So George was there when that happened, and then he came to hear me speak when I was in Florida somewhere, and as he tells it, he said, as I started to talk, he was like, yeah, kind of like, again, somewhat skeptical. He says, but as I continued to speak, and I was so transparent, he said, man, this is real. And he is really sincere. And I didn't really realize it. I knew for some time that George was a Christian. But when I heard him now, and understand the first time I'm hearing this is while I'm watching it on the video.
Wow.
He said, that day that I saw Ted speak was the beginning of the transformation of my own life.
Amazing what God can do, right?
Oh, absolutely. And, and then Sting is another guy where there was just I was just like one guy in a series of things that God did in his life. Like, it's kind of like you connect the dots and you go, okay, I hear you, God.
Mm-hmm.
And I was one of the dots along the way. And he would tell you that. And Sean Waltman, 1-2-3 Kid. I just showed him a lot of love. I don't know how much you know about Sean's background, and I'm not going to go into that. But love conquers a lot of things, and I just showed Sean that I cared about him, and he was very grateful. That's where it begins.
Yeah. And I saw in the documentary, it features interviews with people, all those people that you mentioned, Lex Luger, George the Animal Steel, even Shawn Michaels is featured in it, which is really cool to see. But I want to take you to a spot in the documentary that was very difficult for me to watch as the son of an alcoholic father and just growing up in a dysfunctional family and just knowing what my dad was going through. And you had to kind of have this conversation with your own kids. And it was a conversation that hadn't happened before with your background, your past, and the infidelity and all this other stuff. Your kids didn't know about this. And you had to have that conversation. Talk about that moment and what that was like.
In the midst of the storm, my wife said to me, now you talk about a woman of faith. She said, in spite of what you've done to me, you're a great dad. And your boys hold you on a high pedestal. She goes, I don't want to destroy that. And she said, so until they're old enough to understand this, they don't know it.
Mm.
And they never did. And so it was never spoken about. So all during that time, they didn't have a clue. And they started having a clue as they got older. Well, when I started to go out and speak in churches, and they were there, and they, and I wrote a book, and they read my book, and they, oh my gosh. So, but I still said, look, I just gave that to God and said, God, in your time, it's like if they have any more questions, they'll ask me, and that's how we left it. And so when the idea for the documentary came about, I didn't really realize it, but that's when the questions came. And,
What was that conversation like?
well, it was tough. I mean, I don't think it was as tough at the time as it would have been years ago. Yeah. Because, now my boys have had the time to see how much their mother and their dad love each other and care about each other and how close we are. So that they don't feel any danger or anything like that. But, that underlying question of from where they are, and they're both married now and have children, and they've become dads. How could you do that, Dad? And it's a hard explanation, and I did the best job I could of explaining it to them. It was like, and it's like I think I told Brett, I said it was like a person with two different personalities. Mm. But it's all good because God uses all of it. If nothing else, it has probably done nothing but strengthen the relationship that I have with all of them now.
Ted, looking back now at your time in the WWE and just in wrestling in general for you, was it worth it? Was it worth going through all that?
Absolutely. I mean, people ask me, they said, would you do it all again? I said, obviously hindsight is 20/20, and knowing what I know now, obviously I would have done a lot of things different. And as I try to speak into the lives of young men who approach me now about wanting to be in the wrestling business, the first thing I tell them is, okay, number one, if you're going to be a wrestler, then if you want to, it's like you can't be a wrestler till you're 65. So if you're going to be a wrestler, you got to be one of the top stars to make the kind of money you need to make and invest so you have something else to do when you can't wrestle. And I said, so understand that it's going to demand a lot of your time. So if you're really about being a wrestler, the best way to do it is stay single and wait till you're out of it. I said, but if you can't do that, I said, then you have to build accountability into your life. So a lot of the things that happened with us won't happen. And here, again, to the WWE's credit, they, now, I mean, like they have a 4-day work week. They go to work 4 days a week now, and they go home 3 days every week, not 6 days a month. Now right. It's like, 3 days out every week, and of course, I would say that's not everybody. I mean, if you're a star, again, there's going to be other things that on some of those days you're supposed to be off, or when everybody else is off, you're going to be, you're going to be the flag bearer for the company. So again, it's about building accountability into your life.
A couple more questions. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Ted.
But because that's what are the things that you can build into your life, that will help you maintain your focus and stay away from those things.
A couple more questions here with Ted DiBiase. We appreciate your time, Ted, on the podcast. I just spiritually, you've seemed like you've turned the corner and you're in the best moment in your life with your wife, and things are going great for you as far as your relationship with the Lord, but we all still struggle. And so I'm curious for you, where you are now in your early 60s, what's your biggest struggle in your spiritual life right now?
Because of, it's funny, it's like people say, well, you're 63, you're near retirement age. And I go, yeah, I know I'm technically near retirement age. I said, but I've never seen the word retirement in the Bible.
That's true.
I said, so I don't have any plans of retiring and going to the golf course or whatever. I'm going to keep doing this. And, obviously I would like to do it a little closer to home, but the busyness, it's funny, but the busyness of my life has picked up. I mean, especially now, there's a lot of things happening within the ministry, some changes, the documentary, the things that are going to come as a result of the documentary. And so I guess right now it's giving God that time each day that I need to give him. Does that make sense to you?
Completely,
it's
because
like,
life.
And I preach this, brother.
Yeah.
I go, look, I said, and I tell people that all the time. I said, Ted's not up here looking down at you and speaking down to you, because everything I'm sharing with you comes out of the conviction of my own heart, as God has convicted me. And I said, I challenge people every week in church. I go, look, are you really a Christian? Do you just show up and put in your hour? Are you involved in the ministry of your church? Are you helping to feed the hungry, clothe the naked? And again, even if you're doing those things, are you doing them out of obligation? Are you doing them because your heart says, this is what I need to do? And again, it's spending time with God. Here I am doing ministry. That's the main work of my life now. Yet there's times when I'm so busy doing it that it interferes in my personal private time with God. And so every now and then, God's got to come along and kick Ted in the seat of the pants and go, hey, remember me? I'm the one you're doing this all for. And if you would spend a little more time with me, I could make it a lot easier. When I travel, if I'm flying into to a city to speak for a church, I'll ask them, who are you sending to pick me up? In other words, don't send a woman. And if you do, don't send her alone. And I mean, I don't even think about those things anymore, but they are just safeguards.
They're boundaries. Yeah.
They're boundaries. And it's just like, the Reverend Billy Graham, they said, Reverend Graham would never allow himself to be in a room by himself with a woman, and again, and so another thing, I check into a hotel. Well, a lot of the hotels you check into now, they have pay-per-view movies, and a lot of times they have not only pay-per-view movies, they have adult pay-per-view movies.
Yep.
So I'll tell them at the desk, turn off the adult movies. And they said, well, we can't do that without turning them all off. Then turn them all off.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't have any intention of watching a movie, an X-rated movie. I said, but the Bible tells us to flee.
Yeah.
But all I'm trying to do, every one of those things are just building a little more accountability into my life.
Final question here for you, Ted, and that's awesome. I can completely agree on those boundaries, and it's such a smart way to go, especially when you're on the road a lot. But my last question, this might be a little personal, but I'm just curious. Your dad passed when you were 15, Iron Mike DiBiase, and I'm just wondering if he was still here today. And the documentary kind of paints on this a little bit at the end, but he saw your whole life, how it's turned out, how his son Ted DiBiase turned out. What do you think he'd say to you?
Today, I think he'd be proud of me. I certainly hope that he would. And I tell people, again, I preach it. I said, one day I'm going to die. We're all going to die. And I said, somebody's going to say a eulogy. Somebody's going to speak about your life. How do you want to be remembered? I don't want to be remembered simply for being a wrestling legend. I want to be remembered as a man who left a legacy, who left a legacy of strong character and integrity, and a man who came to the realization that it was much greater reward in giving than receiving, and that I tried to, as much as possible in my way and as I'm led by God, to give back. And to speak and help other people along the way, because I have been so blessed and in so many ways.
He is Ted DiBiase. The documentary is titled The Price of Fame. It's a wonderful film, a beautiful evangelistic tool, I think, and it's in theaters for one night, November 7th. And then more information will come out after that on how people can get a hold of it. Churches will want to get their hands on this, men's ministries for sure. And the website is thepriceoffame.com, thepriceoffame.com. Awesome story of redemption. Ted, thank you so much for sharing your story here and being a part of the podcast. Really enjoyed talking to you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate you having me on. And one more thing, when you go, because a lot of people are asking me, how do I find out what theater it's in near me?
Yes.
When you go to thepriceoffame.com, I believe there's a place where you can enter your zip code.
Yes.
And based on your zip code, it'll direct you to the nearest theater. And the other thing is that it is a one-day event and in the select theaters, and it's going to air at 7 p.m. in all time zones. So whenever it's 7 p.m. in your time zone, that's the time when it's on.
Perfect. That's easy enough. So November 7th, 7 p.m., thepriceoffame.com. Check it out. Awesome documentary. Ted, thanks again.
Thank you very much. God bless.
And what a treat it was to speak to the $1 Million Man himself, WWE legend and WWE Hall of Famer, Ted DiBiase. And it kind of brought me back to my childhood days and thinking about how much I really loved wrestling as a 13, 14-year-old kid in 8th and 9th grade back in the late 80s, and just how much wrestling I really watched. So really cool moment for me, and I hope his story was encouraging to you. I hope it was inspiring to the point where even at your lowest of lows, your lowest point, the mess up that you think cannot be redeemed, the mess up that you think cannot be repaired, man, that's the business God is in. I think it was Matthew West on this podcast a while back who said God is in the junkyard business, and he truly is. He can take whatever you're going through, whatever you've been through, wherever you messed up, whatever wrong you've committed, or whatever wrong that has been committed to you, and he can redeem it. He really can. If we just cling to him, turn to him, and seek him, he's a strong refuge for us when we're in trouble and when we're messed up. And God says, I'm here, man, with my arms wide open waiting for you. Thank you so much for listening to this podcast. As always, you can reach us on Twitter at sports_spectrum. You can tweet at me at Jason Romano, or you can email me, jason@sportspectrum.com. Let us know what you think of the episode. And the one thing we'd love to have you do is click that subscribe button on Apple Podcasts, on iTunes, or wherever you consume your podcast. Click that subscribe button and then go to iTunes and leave a review. Let us know what you think of the podcast. Let us know what you like. A 5-star review would be wonderful, but if you find it a 2-star review or a 3-star review, that's okay. We just want to hear from you. Let us know what you think of the podcast, and let us know how we can do better here at Sports Spectrum. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you next time right here on the Sports Spectrum podcast. Have a great day.